I am Dr. Ricardo Martinez, and this is Cars and Culture with Jason Stein.
Dr. Martinez, an absolute pleasure to have you on the program.
Thank you for the invitation, Jason. A pleasure.
So before we get into your history and all kinds of other fascinating aspects of what you're involved in, I want to talk about where you were recently. And where you were in the photo that was posted, I believe, various social media platforms, was on the field following the Los Angeles Rams victory over the Cincinnati Bengals in the Super Bowl. And you were there surrounded by a bunch of colleagues. And what most people probably wouldn't know is that this is not your first Super Bowl. And in fact, your connection to the NFL is a fascinating one. I found it extremely fascinating. What are you doing as the senior medical advisor for the Super Bowl, by the way, since 1988?
Yeah, it was at the time I was the medical director at Stanford for the emergency department. The athletic department asked us to look at the stadium. We really started improving the kind of emergency response over there. And then they had the earthquake, which moved the 49ers games down to Stanford Stadium, and it got introduced to the NFL. And they asked me to start looking at what they were doing in terms of EMS, spectator care, that sort of thing. And then it's expanded over time, both with the teams, but also with not just the spectators, but we're now big in disaster planning with a lot of security issues. So it's grown. It's a matter of kind of being in the right place in the right time, but then staying on because the team keeps getting better and you keep performing with that every year. One thing I really like about the NFL is that, they're always trying to improve, at least from my perspective. I've always found them very concerned about the spectators, very concerned about the teams, very concerned about even the local population when they come in, because they have an effect on it. So I've been lucky enough to be part of the team, and that's grown. That team has grown. They've added some senior physicians who are phenomenal. Alan Sills, who's the chief medical officer, first one they've ever really had, is phenomenal. He's building a team, and so I get an opportunity to participate. And what they really respect, I find, is institutional knowledge. So every year you can get better and better and learn more and more, and they're always innovating and implementing.
What I guess the basis of what you do there is focused around medical prevention and response planning. And in fact, you live by this creed, the group does, P2R2, planning, prevention, response, and recovery. Now, most folks who watch the game or who attend the game would have no idea exactly what that means. But those are four critical factors that your group relies on. What exactly are you focusing on?
Yeah, so think about this. If something occurs, an incident occurs, your first person may be an operations person, maybe a security person, maybe a medical person, maybe just be a bystander. So we want to make sure that from the moment something happens, we're planning ahead on how to get activation. We have all the different people around the table. As we say, when an incident occurs or disaster occurs, not a good time to exchange business card, right? We plan it all out. We make sure there's an integrated response, and you'll see that just with communications and ingress routes, egress routes, where you're going to open the gates, how we're going to get people through, especially in a high security environment, and then recovering after that. So we go really from end to end on that. And what's interesting, we bring in public health, we bring in sometimes the Red Cross, we bring in the local resources, we talk with all the various hospitals, and a lot has changed over the years, right, in response to pandemic, in response to hurricanes, that sort of stuff. So there's actually, out of Health and Human Services at the state levels and the local level and the federal level, there's different resources we try to integrate. So everybody, security, in my view, operations security and medical or public health are really the big three. When they work together, you really have the sweet spot. You makes it seamless, makes it better integrated, makes sure that we plan ahead and we work as one.
We're going to talk about your journey here next, but I can imagine that you never thought you'd be a number of places, but you probably never thought you'd be involved in the Super Bowl for going on, nearly 30 years.
Yeah, 33 years, and it's been a great journey. We talk about that as a journey. It's one of those things in life you get to participate in. There are certainly others who are in charge, and you want to be a part of that team. That team has grown dramatically, and proud to see it. In fact, some of my colleagues have actually gone on to do even bigger and better things, and you're proud to help initiate that, right? They are just continued to go.
Wonderful. You've been described by some as thoughtful, articulate, insightful, and sometimes irreverent, who has seen the insides of the human body and the insides of the sausage making in Washington, D.C. By the way, for a queasy stomach, perhaps both might be equal in nature. But let's talk about your journey. Let's talk about not only how you got to understand more of the human body, but also the insides of Washington. We'll start with the human body and your beginnings in New Orleans, family medicine, and medical responses to car crashes. Take me back to that.
Yeah, so like many people in the profession, your family had people in the profession, right? So my father was a cardiologist. He's still around, 90 something years old, quit practicing in his 90s. My
Wow.
brothers, two of my brothers are physicians. My mother was a nurse. And so, I kind of grew up in that medical family. What's funny is I told you is that if I hadn't gone into medicine, I was going to go into physics. So I became enamored with injuries, and and especially car crashes. One of my mentors was a surgeon named Norman McSwain, well respected, introduced me to a group called the Association for the Advancement of Automotive Medicine. So it really was a way for me to kind of focus on both. And so started that early on in my career, and have followed that journey in many ways. So that eventually led me to NHTSA.
But fascinated with car crashes. What did you mean by that?
Well, car crashes are really physics applied to the human body. Think about this, Jason. With most diseases, it's a bacteria or a virus. For injuries, it's actually energy, right? And so it's energy applied. No one ever says, "Hey, I think I'm coming down with a broken leg," right? Or it's just suddenly fine, and then the energy is applied. And if it goes past the threshold, you have an injury. The thing I liked about the injuries patterns is that they are very predictable. So if you have someone comes in with, let's say, a side impact car crash versus frontal versus a rear, you have different injuries that you look for. And so just like if someone has high blood pressure, we would check for the brain, the kidneys, and the heart is being affected. We can do the same thing with injuries. So I like those, be able to identify those patterns. But then more importantly is the prevention aspect of it too, getting into the public and trying to do some innovative things to decrease those injuries.
But loving physics. So did you want to launch rockets instead if you hadn't done this?
Great point. Not sure where would it all gone. I went down the medicine side. I got enamored with it when I saw how they were measuring gravitational waves. And how's that for geeky? But in my
Measuring
career,
gravitational waves.
yes, but in my career, I've always had strong relationships with engineers, right? And I found that engineers know a lot about this, but they don't know how the person got injured. And I know we have the people who are in the hospital side know all about how to treat them, but don't know how they got them. So I never felt that I was a great researcher. I was like a giant sheepdog, and I would just kind of push these groups together, and they get a kind of a more holistic perspective. And then you can start doing more with prevention, right?
A giant sheepdog. What a great analogy. You worked closely with engineers, as you mentioned, architects and designers, but you also developed this national reputation on injury care and prevention. You came to be known as the guy to go to as it related to that. What aspects of that, injury care or prevention, were you most focused on?
That's a great question, because I thought both were equally important. We focus a lot in medicine on the treatment and trying recovery, but I always told people that for a long time there's been this very famous insight: Humpty Dumpty, fell off a wall, and all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty back together again. And so really started looking at, when you look at all these injuries, the way we were doing it. Let's say this river, you're on the river, right? And you see these injured people coming down the stream, and you start going out, bringing them back. But because there's so many, you get some pre-river paramedics who go out and get those people for you, so you can start building a big facility on the side of the riverbank. And then you got so many patients, you build a big rehab center. And then somebody says one day, "Who's throwing all these people in the river? Where'd they come from?" So you go up the river and you see that there's a bridge with a piece of section missing, and the people are falling into the river. Well, that's the greatest opportunity, right?
Mhm.
Because you can go upstream and you can intervene then. So we did both. We actually looked at where the injuries were, but also try to figure out where they're coming from. So things like at Stanford, when we found we had a lot of head injuries from not having bicycle helmets, we really went on programs where we went into the community we gave prescriptions so you could get a discount, right, at the local bike shop. So we try to do things that actually intervened earlier on. And so that's how I got to be known as a crazy guy.
Yeah. But the helmet is the helmet to bike satisfies the analogy or relates to the analogy of the bridge without the section of it intact, because if you can
And
prevent early.
yeah, and think about this. So we saw all these students would gear up with all this gear for their big bike rides on the weekends, but during school they never wore their helmets, and we'd see these people with head injuries or potential for serious injuries. What we found was there was no place for them to put their helmet when they rode their bicycles. So maintenance essentially began to put little helmet lockers so people could put their helmets there. And you saw helmet use go up. Whenever you see use of preventive devices go up, you see the injuries go down. So it's really a matter of different issues at different countermeasures you can implement.
As an aside, I'm guessing that your own view of states that don't have helmet laws for motorcycles drives you nuts.
Well, it's always interesting to me because when someone yells, my rights, my freedoms, fine, don't send me the bill. Okay, you don't do that. And so it's a very simple thing. It's funny, the same guys who sometimes tell me, don't tell me to wear a helmet, would then put their helmet on and go to work because they worked in construction, right? So, well, why you wear it? Well, I want to keep my job, right? And I want to make sure that I'm not injured at work. So we have this kind of strange view of it from people. And yeah, I had to fight those dialogues all the time, or let's say temper it with facts, right? Because you can change a lot of things, you can't change the laws of physics, right? And so riding without a helmet's like riding on the hood of a car. You're unprotected, you get thrown, and you're leading with your head. So it's a very effective device.
Yeah, well, you became medical director of the emergency department and associate director of trauma at Stanford Medical Center, and then you get a call from a 202 area code.
Yeah. I have a friend of mine. We always played phone jokes to each other. Like he would come to my house and call up and ask them to make the phone number unlisted. Then I couldn't call to get my own phone number back after they changed it, right? So we did all that. And so one day I got a call from 202, the quote White House, asking me to, because of my focus on car crashes, if I was interested in the position at NHTSA. I thought it was a joke. I thought 202 was New York City, which turns out to be 212.
Right.
And about 2 weeks later, I was getting my hair cut because our hair was fairly long. We used to wear trauma tails, and in major traumas, we put our hair up in ponytails. And I had a phone for the helicopter service, which I also oversaw. And so I made a phone call from the barber shop, and I said, they answered the phone, White House signal. And I said, excuse me? And I gave them the name of the person who had called, and they said, transferring you to operations and personnel. And I turned to the barber and I said, cut this off. and I did, and that's how the journey started.
How much did you know about NHTSA before the 202 phone call?
A lot. I mean, I had done a lot of work in car crashes. They were a great resource. I had written to them in the past. I'd gotten information from them. Their statistics, their education programs. They also just see what people may or may not know, but emergency medical services in this country actually comes out of NHTSA, because from the Korean War, we realized that having that ability to scoop people up and bring them to care was a countermeasure. So countermeasures that are important are before the crash, during the crash, and after the crash. So after the crash was emergency medical services. And so that was really the main driver, was car crashes in this country, to put emergency medical services in.
So what'd you find? I mean, here you are, a career medical industry guy, hospital. I think you were the first doctor to take on the role. Certainly one of a few, or were you the first in order to
No,
lead?
it wasn't the first. The actual first was a physician. It was actually a guy named Bill Haddon, who I learned about from reading articles as a resident to put them into an index. And he was both an engineer and a physician, and literally changed the world, because he really said, let's look at it from both perspectives. And so the beginning of the standards Not saying it's just the driver or a quote nut behind the wheel, but it was that the vehicle itself can absorb that energy and provide protections for people. And so that's how NHTSA was formed. And actually, the order of before the crash, during the crash, and after the crash comes from him and his work.
Well, you were certainly second or one of a few. How important was it for second? Okay.
The rest were lawyers, I think, for the most part. Yeah, because they
Right.
made it a regulatory agency. To me, it wasn't. It was a public health agency, right?
Yeah. So you approach it as a public health agency, and how do you change it? What's one of the first things that you wanted to do? What did you encounter when you got to DC?
Well, it's funny. It had a very small constituency, mostly lawyers and kind of the quote unquote safety groups in the car companies, all a very small group. To me, this is leading cause of death, major problem in society worldwide, actually. So we really tried to expand the constituencies. You could have a greater voice from those who were affected the most, right? And I also had an agency that was really somewhat being restricted because it was seen as regulatory only. So it's down to, I believe, its lowest budget when I got there, fairly demoralized staff. People were very anti-regulatory. But in truth, they were very passionate. It's a beautiful mission that the agency has. It's not trying to promote anything other than decreasing deaths and injuries. And so people who could have made a lot of money in private sector were there dedicating their lives, and some of the best experts in the world were there. So what they needed was resources, leadership, someone to speak for them. And as I told my team as we built them, I will take all the hits. So you go get your job done. Your job is to make sure I don't have to take a lot of hits, right? So that was the relationship that I wanted, and they were fabulous. And so, at first they were very little insular, but we modernized the practices. We get rid of stovepipes inside the building. We went straight to the public for a lot of things, so we could make sure we were bypassing all the lobbyists and going straight to the public. And so you really saw, and we were very bipartisan. Car crashes and injuries are not partisan. They should not be, right?
Not a partisan thing, right?
Yeah. So we really did our best to do that.
And you set new U.S. safety records and issued the largest number of recalls and major rules. You rebuilt the agency, and in fact dealt with the airbag crisis effectively. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so I went there because I really respected the agency. Thought it was an opportunity to do a lot of good as a physician. And when I got there, the agency needed some resources, revamping the processes, and actually some renewal, right? And so we did, and really started building a much more proactive and efficient, effective team. And thank God we did, right? Because when issues started popping up, we were able to respond to those, resolve those. The airbag one was terrible, really, right? Because it's the safety equipment. This is like a physician's nightmare, and everybody else's nightmare. The safety equipment is causing the injuries because at low speeds, if it's talking about being energy, you're not being exposed to a lot of energy at low speeds. But the airbag was adding energy. And so they weren't as sophisticated as they are now. The original sensor was a ball bearing in a metal tube. How sophisticated is that, right? Very mechanical before the cars became much more electrical. And so interesting enough, Jason, to help solve the problem, because this all occurred in about 25 milliseconds. Think about that. The crash was like 90 to 120 milliseconds. I actually went to NASA, and Dan Gold, I believe his name Gold, was, believe it or not, a former airbag engineer. But we got Jet Propulsion Lab and others to help us really understand how to intervene on that real fast and preserve the benefits of the airbag, but minimizing the risk.
You not only went to NASA, but in fact, you went to a high performance driving school and raced open wheel cars on a closed course in order to understand the experience of, I'm guessing, even higher speed physics. Tell me why you did that.
Yeah, it's funny you said that, because it really does boil down to be a lot of physics, right? When you're making your turn, you're looking at your arc that you can go in and out. But I went out to go, first off, I really enjoy cars and I really like speed. And, one of the great things about being the administrator was going to visit different test tracks and seeing how the different companies had their own view of how the vehicle responded, and got to really appreciate the engineering that was in there. So when there was two issues for going to the racing school. One was the opportunity to experience it from really the professionals, and they taught me a lot about what people should know and don't know. And the second one was, believe it or not, he asked about the culture of the industry. When we talked about safety, I'd be called a safety Nazi. What the hell is that? I mean, because I was interested in safety. Yet
Someone
this is
really
where,
interested in safety.
yeah, but I mean, you're a safety Nazi. So, in truth, I'm a car guy. And so having the opportunity to go and share that time, I think was helpful. In many ways, we did the same thing with motorcycles, took motorcycle training and did it with some of the organizations that we spoke to. I'm a big believer in Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln had this great quote that said, the best way to devastate your enemy is to befriend them. And so we look for common ground and the common shared experiences. Then you'd often find people have the same concerns you did, just maybe different perspectives on it, or they had a fear you were going to ruin what they had or what they were experiencing. And so that just allowed us to have a more effective dialogue.
You had a extensive dialogue with automakers, I'm guessing, and maybe their tiered suppliers. How did those interactions go?
Well, it's funny, I was thinking about this when we were preparing for this call. I got along because of the Association of Automotive Medicine, Advanced Automotive Medicine. I was working with engineers all the time, and I didn't realize we're supposed to hate each other until I got to DC, where because there's this whole thing called
Speaking of befriending your enemy.
Yeah, but there's this whole thing called lobbyists, which sometimes it almost looked like a works program. So I found every company, had a little bit different culture. U.S. versus European were also very different too. Japanese were a little bit different too. But oftentimes if I had an issue, I would just bypass DC and fly to Detroit and meet with the CEOs directly. And as you know, each one's a little different. There was some lovely people who were CEOs who really were being told things were crises that were really opportunities. And so I found that the best way to deal with some of that. The other thing is I really went out of my way to make sure I had good relationships with Congress, both chambers, because one thing I learned back at Stanford from a mentor is if you don't tell your story, somebody else will and you won't like it. So we went and started meeting with them, and it was very helpful because they'd start calling you to ask what was really going on.
Were there some car companies who indeed saw you as the foe? And how did you deal with them?
Yeah, well, they did. Look, Detroit was, I think, still stuck in the idea that we're Detroit and we're these big guns. And in truth is, the shift was moving to the consumers. There was many more entrants coming into the marketplace. And so they had to kind of meet the consumer where they were. So one of the things we tried to do, as I said, expand our constituency dramatically. I added a bunch of nursing organizations and medical organizations too, and public health organizations. In fact, one of the nursing organizations, I had like 6 or 7 nurses in the NHTSA, and they changed NHTSA to mean Nurses Hired to Save America, right? So they were great. So, and then I went on all the morning shows. I went on a lot of the TV shows, and we did was just go directly to the consumer and generate demand. One thing the car companies are pretty good at is trying to respond to consumer demand, and hopefully, as they move forward, you try to go and meet the consumers where they are and what they need. And for some companies, they were very focused on being mechanical engineers, kind of too heavy on lawyers and engineers. And really what you need is a really, quote unquote, multicultural, or a lot of different people in, so you can have a new culture, a new view. And you'll see that happening now with the entrance of the tech companies who have a very, very different perspective. The European manufacturers, I think, had a much more social view of where things were and how they interfaced. Volvo being one, BMW, Mercedes, others like that. And so, they're changing, but I think there's opportunity for them to change more.
You also changed the term while you were the administrator, the term accidents to crashes. And while it's a subtle difference, it is, and if you'll excuse the expression, impactful. Explain why.
Yeah, so one of the things you learn early on when you're doing injury prevention is that if you call it an accident and you see it as an accident, then you're really not acknowledging that this is pretty predictable, preventable, and you have this opportunity to intervene.
It almost says you have no role in the.
Yeah, it's like, you come in, a kid pulls something off and you say, what happened? So it was an accident. And so that's not really the best way to look at it. I mean, from the scientific view, or even from a perspective mentally, right? If you see it as a preventable and predictable, let's say, for example, I say, hey, Jason, why don't we get in a car? Don't be belted up, drink heavy, go fast. What could happen? I don't know, it'd be an accident. No, it's very predictable, preventable what can happen. So therefore, our ability to implement countermeasures becomes much more effective that way. So we did make that subtle change, but also remember, the words you use often reflect what you think and what you think over time. And so we saw more and more people saying, hey, you know what can we do about this? And so we'll help give you the tools to implement so you can save those lives. Look, almost everyone on this podcast knows someone, either mostly in high school or college, who died from a car crash, who was severely injured from a car crash. If you think about it, what would you do to prevent that? Everything. And so we do have known prevention opportunities, whether it's a seatbelt, whether it's a drunk driving rule, whether it's education, something. But the thing is, find the problem. Pedestrians, another issue, right? Find the problem, do an intervention, but look at it as that. It's a predictable and preventable event. Same story, different people every day.
Was the community, and I mean the industry and or DC, interested in that kind of approach to what you were doing? Or
Not
was
at all. Not at all. So it showed, my memo showed up, I think, in the back page of the Washington Post magazine. One of my staff leaked it out to show how crazy we were. The thing about it is, it's still named that way, and people like the fatal crash analysis is now fatal accident analysis is fatal crash analysis. People have adopted that. It's gone on, but you'll always have change. Is hard for some people. Saying it's just a regulatory agency to it's a public health agency. That was a hard one, but that's the way people look at it. That's what people want from it. Especially when we look at the effects on our children. I mean, it's throughout life, right? Children, pregnant women. It was, our youth, teenagers, elderly. There's all kinds of opportunities to address the issue if we really look at it as, in this case, or these issues that occur. Like I told you, the river story, right? That was needing someone to see it as a predictable, preventable issue and then go fix it upstream.
Well, and one of the other issues that you really tried to tackle was bringing this conversation to the supper table, and especially as it related to the acquisition or the obtaining of a driver's license. You said once a driver's license is something we pass an exam for once, and then we're almost competent for life. Just look at how much technology has changed with ABS and traction control. We should look at this more as a periodic recertification. Now, certainly, the graduated part of driver's licenses is much more of a European view. I mean, if you try to get a driver's license in Germany, it takes you years. It does not take you years to be, in some states, 15 and a half and behind the wheel of a car, and then no longer recertified.
No, in fact, we had people from Germany come into the United States to get a license and then go back over because we have such a lower really a limit to get in. We also, believe it or not, we were one of the highest levels for blood alcohol you could run around and drive in, right? So we really have to look at our whole system as a system. Each state's differently. So we were you have incentive programs for it. But for cars, we do change over time. And the two areas we probably have the greatest variation is in youth and then as you get older. And both of those are areas that are still looking for good solutions, I think, though there is a lot of variation out there on what you can do and not do for people.
The United States is enduring its most severe increase in traffic deaths since the 1940s. This has occurred just in the last year or so. It's actually a sharp change from the recent norm when deaths from vehicle crashes have generally been falling since the 1960s. But apparently during COVID, when most experts assumed that roads would be empty and traffic fatalities would be lower, the opposite is true. Per capita vehicle deaths rose 17.5% from the summer of 19 to last summer. That was according to the New York Times. What do you make of that? And what would you do if you were in the chair at this point?
Wow, there's a very interesting thing about driving safety, and that you find that people who are high risk are high risk, not just at home or in work, whatever, but on the road. And so one of the things that was fascinating was that if police increased their law enforcement of traffic issues, you found more outstanding felons out there with warrants for their arrest because they're high risk anyway, right? I just reviewed this, came out from NHTSA. They just did their statistics, I want to say this last week, to get a finer point on that. But the number of vehicle miles traveled actually decreased. The number of injuries actually decreased, but the number of fatalities went up, more in tune with these being crashes in which the person did not wear their safety belt. So it is very disconcerting. But what I get out of it on first blush, Jason, is that the people who are high risk aren't wearing their seat belts. They were out during the period of time they're driving. They might have been driving, I don't know, or they might have been driving with a more risky behavior. But the bottom line is it showed up big time and surprisingly in this COVID period when you really saw the miles driven go down.
It's a bit of a paradox, isn't it?
Yeah. If your miles go down, usually everything goes down.
Right.
But in this one, as I look at it, it was an increase. I want to say like 17%, but it was pretty high. Yeah, it was pretty high at fatalities, not injuries overall, but fatalities, and it's pretty hard to die in a car crash nowadays in many ways, unless you're unbelted or you have an override between the two vehicles, because or it's high speed, right? So all of those, at least two of those, go more in line with risky type behavior or risk behavior.
Yeah, Theory in the Time story actually focused on frustration, anger, and a lot of other pent-up aggression during COVID, given the circumstances of stay at home, lockdown, work at home.
Yeah, it could be. It's funny. You look at our last big pandemic, 1819. The Roaring '20s came after that.
1918.
Yeah, so the Roaring '20s came after that because people kind of went wild afterwards. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see that same thing happening here.
You've been on the firsthand and front lines of the pandemic, both strategically and tactically. And what have you seen? What's your analysis as a medical professional of COVID?
Well, yeah, it's a pretty efficient machine. I got to tell you that. And what's interesting over time, I've been through several things, right? HIV coming in, when SARS came through, and others. And you always start off with, you really have very little in your armamentarium. You don't have any test. Your interventions are not so great. And that's the same thing for what it's worth as their analogy with injuries. It's getting better. Cars today just have so many great technology in them. But early on, it was just terrible, right? Because people would get on a respirator, they couldn't get off a respirator. We didn't know the mechanism by which their lungs would flood. People who were high risk had very little reserve to be able to take anything. And over time, we found that just the basic things like isolation, washing, keeping people separate provided some protection. But once you got it, it really overwhelmed us. And those patients were in the hospital for a very long period of time. We're running out of respirators. Over time, our ability to offer some treatments helped out. The vaccinations began to come in, so that gave people additional antibodies to it. And then now the next wave, Omicron, that was much more infectious, and that would jump from one place to another faster. But we already have people now with their antibodies, and it sounds terrible, but the people highest risk had already been hit. So we actually saw that it was still causing hospitalizations, but also for the people who protected, they had a little less effects. And now we're beginning to come out with even oral pills. So this is, I hate to say it, the same pattern that occurs when HIV first came out, when SARS first came out. But now I think this was probably one of the fastest responses that I've seen. That has to do with today's technology.
From a medical point of view, are we going to be dealing with COVID for a long time? Are we just going to be living with it in various mutations and variants? Yeah,
it's a guess, right? But I would say, yeah, because look at the flu. I mean, we talked about the last pandemic being the flu, but now every year you get a vaccine. we have it much more in the population. It's gone from being a pandemic to being something just cycles once a year, a lot less, still pretty infectious, but a lot less, what's the right word, I guess, lethal. We still, what people forget is that we still lose tens of thousands of older people every year secondary to having the flu. And so we now have things, not antibiotics, but antivirals we can give them. And we also have better treatment plans for them. Interesting enough, by the way, because everybody's wearing the mask and washing their hands, we almost saw no flu last year, right? Because that works.
Let's get back to cars. You've consistently raised the idea that each major car company should have a chief medical officer, not focused on their employees, but on their customers. Make a case for why a car company needs a CMO, in this case, medical officer.
Yeah, look, to me, it's funny. Years ago, GM used to actually have a big medical advisory board with some big names. And, things have changed. We have to meet with the consumer where they are. And for them, they're driving the purchase decisions. We're talking about, we want people to adopt electric vehicles. We want people to adopt autonomous vehicles. And the question is, what's the thinking behind the decisions that are being made? Is it being made by a legal person? Is it being made by an engineering person? Is it being made by a physician? Is it being made by a team that consists of multiple perspectives so that they're doing the best for you? So I see the thing that's missing is the chief medical officer. And again, not focused on the employees, but on you, the consumer, who I want to have a relationship with for your entire lifespan. It would actually add another voice to the table that gives different perspective. Number two is completely change your relationship with the consumers, with the policymakers, with the media. It would really be a differentiator in the market. And, we started something called Siren Network. So it was engineers and physicians together looking at car crashes. And I remember very well one of the engineers turning to me saying, I'm not sure exactly what it is, but I'm seeing things very differently now. That's a dialogue that has to continue to exist. When I started out in my journey trying to learn more about car crashes, I went and met with engineers. And what I found was they knew a lot about dummies. They didn't know much about people. And I'll give you the greatest example of that. We were up in Canada, and we were looking at how much pressure or compression you can have on the chest. And they said, anything over 2 intrusion, let's say, with this from the seatbelt over 2 inches will kill you. Well, the same day, the American Heart Association came out and said, if you're going to do proper CPR, got to go at least 2 inches. So, to me, let's get everybody around the table. Let's have that relationship. And then I always think about poor Mary Barra. Here she was trying to defend a decision made by an engineer, and behind her are a bunch of engineers and lawyers. What if there was a bunch of physicians behind her too, who were advising her and giving her perspective? So that is a missing component of the car companies. The tech companies have chief medical officers that are focused on their consumers. Apple's moving to become much more of a health company for you, right? Amazon's getting into it. So the car companies have this huge opportunity, and it's about transforming and being innovative. Look, we can go back when the cars were all mechanical and we started seeing electronics coming in. There was a big pushback. You don't understand cars. If you talk about doing a patch to software, it drive people crazy, right? So remember when Scott McNeely said that cars someday will be computers on wheels, and they laughed him out of town. So turns out now we can't build cars because we don't have enough chips. So sometimes you got to look down the road and say, how do I position myself now to be in the leadership role and be first in the market to do that? And I will tell you, that is a missing opportunity to have around the table with the executive team. A chief medical officers out there looking at crashes, talking to the public, pregnant women, older people, adding those views in from the medical perspective. It's not to replace anybody, it's an added perspective, and it's missing.
And it would transform the culture of the company, as you allude to. It would be a major shift from an engineering focused industry to something where the consumer truly comes first. Is there anybody out there who you feel could make that transition?
Yeah, it's funny. I've talked over the years to various people, and some are very insular, right? And no way. The two I would tell you, Bill Ford I always enjoyed because his name's on the wall. If you remember when Bill came out and said we need to be much more focused on climate change, they almost ran him out of town, right? Even though
He's been on this program to talk about that.
yeah, and so I was shocked by that, but that was the ingrained culture. The other person who really I find very innovative is Jose Munoz, and he was asked at Nissan. We have this conversation, but he's a change agent. He's a transformative guy, and he's also got some European background where you're focused much more on the social side as opposed to the industrial side. So I would put my bets on probably one of those two at this point.
Both men have been on Cars and Culture, talking about cars and culture. If we think about that kind of transformational leadership and the vision for doing something like that, what's going to be the impetus, Dr. Martinez, to get a car company thinking that way?
Well, the impetus is
autonomous vehicles.
Yeah, it's about how do we build that relationship with the person who chooses us versus others. I mean, there's more entrance into the car companies or the vehicles than ever before. Secondly, we're moving from transportation vehicles, right, or transportation industry or car industry to a mobility industry. I mean, I probably should have thrown someone from Toyota in there too, right? Because they're very focused. When you're talking about mobility, all of a sudden you're hearing conversations that when we used to raise 20 and 30 years ago, people would think we're crazy, right? Mobility, aging population, social determinants of health. How do we get people to get their medications? How do we get them to the doctor? How do we get them to get groceries? All these things. And so people are looking at the essential function of transportation. Either you're moving people, goods, or information, the latter part being kind of digital communications. But there's this huge opportunity to expand your market, I think, from being positioned to where you're not just a car company, but you're a company that is building things to meet your needs. A great example of that to me is Apple. It was a phone. It was a watch. And now what they've done is they made that part of our lives.
Yeah, true enough. When I was at Automotive News, you wrote an op-ed piece for the publication going back to March of 2019, where you talked about the acceptable death rate for autonomous cars. And you said, yes, people die in car crashes every day, but that shouldn't be an excuse to kill more people. And one of the interesting things that you wrote at the outset of the article was, before a surgeon cracks open your chest, ask him his acceptable death rate for patients. And you equated that to climbing on board an airplane, asking the pilot the same thing, and you'd hope that their answer was 0. But in contrast, that race to bring autonomous cars to market appears to have abandoned that notion of public safety. What did you mean by that?
Well, there's this thing called Vision Zero that Klaus Tingvall, who's a good friend, brought forward in Sweden, right? So rather than say, okay, we'll design the infrastructure and the highways, but there's nothing you can do about preventing everything. That's on you. So what they decided was, we're going to accept responsibility for anyone who gets injured or dies as a failure. We'll never get there. That's the most important thing. We'll never get there. Everybody goes to the litigation and liability right away. I'm a physician. Don't tell me about liability, all right? Seriously, I think that's an excuse, right? So, but it's about accepting responsibility. So when we design everything, we're doing the best we can. And every crash is an opportunity to get better. And every crash is an opportunity for us to learn more. So when you accept that and say, that's how we're going to envision ourselves contributing to society, that's a different approach. Look, there is a 0 acceptable death rate in medicine. Will we ever get there? I doubt it. But I will tell you, it's about our ethics and our covenant with the public that makes you say, okay, you're trying your best, you're going to keep doing it. And there's some, it's very interesting that in medicine, if we injure somebody or we have a treatment that doesn't work, we publish that. And everyone says, oh, well, liability. Well, we're publishing that stuff because people expect it. Every day we're getting better. Every day we've learned something new. I had 2 types of car companies that I met with. It used to be, we call up and say, hey, look, just so you know, one of your customers got a knee injury from a screw that popped through the dash. We wanted you to know about that. So the ones that have the great culture would say, hey, we're very concerned about our customer, we'll send someone out right away. That's like maybe two organizations I can count. The rest of them, about 2 weeks later, you get a letter from their lawyers that would say, we met the standard, please leave us alone. Huh. Over time, which one are you going to buy from?
Right.
Which one are you going to trust? Which one do you think is constantly trying to improve based on my health? And I think that's where the big shift is occurring in the consumer. We used to not be where we are now. We're very much a consumer-driven economy. People have choices. The market's getting more crowded. So how do you transform to be the relationship of choice? Because these car companies, and I really like them in so many ways, it's amazing what they've done to change our world. But years ago, they began to realize we want a relationship that's long-term. So they started adding services like OnStar and things like that. Well, you can have a relationship that's long-term by repositioning yourself in the market. And then I will stay with you because you are my go-to person, understands me as I travel through life, and my needs change. And you design based on any feedback I give you, you see as an opportunity to improve. So I think I'm waiting to see who's going to take the first step on that.
Will the startups push the traditional car companies to approach this differently, or will the startups have a different mentality?
Well, I think that's the great thing is that, a lot of them are either integrated or buying each other up. And it's unfortunate because they can't just change. It's very hard to change these big complex organizations, but it does start with changing your culture at the top. But right now is they're importing culture. And then the question is, always the argument is who changes who, right? And so I think having a lot of these startups, they're outside the company for a reason. The big question is, can they integrate and become a transformative force? Or do you do what some companies just do and said, okay, you guys make a mechanical over here and you guys make an electrical over here. Not quite sure how that's great company, but I'm not quite sure how that's going to be perceived in the public as to who's making decisions and what is the overall corporate culture. So it's a thought that's just, comes up in my mind.
I started with a quote about you, about what you saw from the human body to the sausage making in Washington. And I'll leave with this quote. He's got a real want to help people, Dr. Martinez does, which in this day of it's all about me belief system is a heartening perspective to see in someone. He very much wants to continue to help the greatest number of people he can. I'm guessing that's probably one of the greatest compliments one can receive.
Well, that feels very good. I thank you for sharing that with me.
Yes, for sure. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us here today on Cars and Culture, because you've represented everything, cars and culture, and in fact, the merging of both worlds. Dr. Martinez, thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
The automobile is one of the most important inventions that revolutionized the modern world. In America, the rich history of car culture runs deep as technology continues to shape the future of the industry. Jason Stein,
former publisher of Automotive News,
is here to share the stories of people passionate about cars, from industry leaders and innovators to car-obsessed celebrities. Buckle up as Jason takes you inside the boardroom, onto the track, and around the bend on Cars and Culture on SiriusXM Business Radio.